Yeah. Improve the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Good morning. You know, our lesson today is on Zacchaeus. And Larry was texting Amy before I left, and she asked me, was I gonna sing that little song about Zacchaeus? You may remember it, and I told her, sent a message for her to brief you on it, and I was gonna let you do that, Charles. Did you get that message?
I didn't get that.
You know, this is Sunday school, and it's on the record with that, that line in Sunday school and all that. Not a good place for it. Zacchaeus, you know, I did learn about Zacchaeus when I was a young kid in Sunday school, but I know more about Zacchaeus being a little short fella, a sycamore tree climber, and allegedly I say, a thief, than I do about what I'm supposed to learn spiritually about the story of Zacchaeus. You know, some would say that Zacchaeus was a despised little man. I don't really understand that altogether. I guess I can in a way, but why do you want to hate the man that collects the taxes? He just does his job. You know, Jim Thorpe was my tax collector for several years. I've never admired paying taxes, but I never felt hard toward Jim about it. Matter of fact, I called Jim a friend. And I think he's well respected and liked. But in Zacchaeus' time, is a little different. Tax collectors were hated because they were seen as traitors, because they worked for the conquerors of the Jews, the Roman government. You know, it's pretty easy to paint with a broad brush and hate somebody because of what they do. You can hate people because they work for the government now. You know, it makes about as much sense as hating a policeman because they enforce the law, or hating Jews because they're not a Christian, or hating Christians because they're not Muslims, hating the Chinese because we all know they're technology thieves. We certainly hate the Russians because they corrupt all our elections and trying to kill us, but you know, if you meet some of those people on an individual basis, you feel a little different about them than you do when you just throw them all in one box and just hate them all. You know, Jesus could have taken a shot at all tax collectors in one of his sermons, Sermon on the Mount, but he didn't do that. As a matter of fact, he picked out one of these guys to talk to speak to, and to go home in that time. You know, I guess they didn't have any Holiday Inn Express or anything like that to stay in at the time. You just, when you were going somewhere, you just stayed with somebody because that's what you had to do. And people took other people in their house. They might not have known them. Obviously, Jesus was born in a stable, and I'll say a little more about that. But you know, I got to thinking about those Roman taxes, and the Romans are kind of interesting to me anyway. But before the time of Augustus, the Romans did what was called tax farming. And every few years they bid out the job of being the tax collector. And the guy that got the bid paid the taxes to the Romans in advance. And then during the rest of his tenure, it was his job to get his money back and maybe make a little profit. You know, put a little interest on it. I don't know about you, but that's what I call a license to steal, you know? They don't know what you paid, but these guys ended up being the wealthiest people in society. One way, they ended up being the banker because they already had some money and they had money coming in. And it wasn't always money. A lot of times they'd end up with large stockpiles of grain, which they held on to and sold during hard times when people, and this is what I read. I don't know how they stored that grain, Bill, back then, since they didn't have any good grain bins or anything. Like, how could you hold it over till a drought came or something? But some kind of way, it was said that they stored the grain until hard times and made big money that way too. As bankers, it's said that some of them charge as much as 4%, which that doesn't sound like too much, except it was 4% every month. You know, it's kind of like when I was working construction, we had a little deal where you lend a guy $20 on Monday because he'd be broke, and he'd pay you back $25 on Friday when he got paid. I've done a little bit of that both ways. That 5% adds up over time. But the other thing is the Gospel of Luke, which this story comes from, the 2nd chapter begins with, in those days there was a decree issued by the Emperor Augustus for a registration to be made throughout the Roman world. You know, I learned those 14 verses when I was in the 3rd grade. It's because it's a Christmas story. But I always had a little bit of, who is this Augustus guy? Wow, what's he doing in there? I don't hear him talk about too much about him being a big Christian advocate. But the reason Augustus was mentioned in that verse was they probably knew it well, because Augustus changed the way they were collecting their taxes. Instead of doing that tax farming thing where the guy just paid the tax in advance and then got all he could out of the job, they changed to a straight 1% to 2% tax, which doesn't sound too bad. I don't know. I guess it depends on what all you count in that 1% to 2%. But they went to that flat rate, and that's the reason why Joseph and Mary were going to Bethlehem, was to do the census. You can't charge a 1% to 2% flat rate on the population unless you know how many people are in the population. Not too much different from that form they sent me just the other day about filling out how many of us there are. If you're gonna tax people, you gotta make an accounting of the people. So, but our lesson today unfolds as Jesus is coming into Jericho, and I'll let Jim read that for me if he would.
Okay, guys, here we go. Luke 19, 1 through 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was very short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood out there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come for this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost.
Thank you. So I know you've heard that story before, but it takes us back to Jericho, You know, there's archaeologists and biblical scholars have some differences in the way they date things, but archaeologists say that Jericho is one of the most ancient historical sites in the world. Archaeologists suggest that Jericho began as a campground as much as 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years before the birth of Christ. And the wall around Jericho might have been started around 8,000 years ago, some say, the way they date things. And the reason that site had so much appeal for ancient settlers was the fact that it's fed by, there's a spring there that's fed by water. And you know, it's amazing that water's been such a draw, maybe for 12,000 years. And there's still folks out there struggling to have some of it every day. But, you know, we take it for granted, but it's pretty essential if you can't have it. But, you know, at any rate, Joshua and Caleb marched on Jericho around 1400 years before Christ. And today's lesson is 1400 years after that. After the city was first captured, and they blew the horns and the walls came down and they sacked the city. But Jesus, where we are with Jesus in the Bible before this, just before in like chapter 1 that we didn't read, Jesus told his guys what was going to happen to him, and it was coming in short order. But I don't know, it said it didn't, it either said it didn't register with them, or that they were made where they couldn't understand it. You can read that for yourself. But one way or another, I mean, things were going pretty well. People were following Jesus. He was healing people, all those kind of things. They couldn't see that in short order they'd be trying to crucify Jesus, because wherever he went, crowds of people were lining the road. And that's the way it was when he was coming into Jericho, which I looked on the map. It looks like to me, Dr. Schleifer were here, he could help us with that. It looks to be about 10 or 12 miles from Jericho to Jerusalem. But crowds of people were lining the road, not unlike they were when he came into Jerusalem. And if that wasn't enough, on the way in, there was a blind guy on the side of the road hollering for Jesus to help him, and he just stopped and gave him his sight back. So you can imagine what kind of a atmosphere there was there that precipitated Zacchaeus, a short fella, trying to figure out how he was going to get a look at Jesus. Like I said, I'll buy the fact that Zacchaeus was short, because the Bible proclaims it. He climbs a tree, that also to see, so he could see, that supports it. But I don't know whether he was a thief and defrauded his people or not. You know, like I said earlier, if you take a job working for the enemy, your reputation is going to take a hit. And the Bible says he was a tax collector, but Luke doesn't say he was a thief. Luke said the people said he was a thief. Well, you know, the people said in just a few days from then that Jesus deserved to be crucified. So that part where the people say, I don't know. But at any rate, you know, he wasn't respected. He was a sinner, according to Luke. I don't know many people that wouldn't have to be thrown in that basket if you speak of them generally, you know, he's a sinner like many of us. The author of the teacher's book stated that he was a thief, and he said that if Jesus changed him from that type of behavior to one where he was no longer that, and that if he did that as quickly as this story tells, that right there should be seen as one of Jesus's greatest miracles, because you just don't turn people around from kind of behavior that they've been practicing all their life and then bam, it's gone like that. And he makes a good point. Also, the point is made that Jesus didn't befriend all the people that everybody thought that he should befriend. He picked out some of those that were, he said he came to help those that needed help, and those that didn't need help, you know, those weren't the ones he selected. But Zacchaeus was a rich man, and I've heard it quoted many times that it's harder for a rich man to get to heaven than it was for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. But I think we all know what quote that was associated with. It was not Zacchaeus, it was a rich young ruler. And that rich young ruler followed the law, he said. He didn't offer to give up any of his wealth to follow Jesus. Yet, this so-called crook, Zacchaeus, offered to give away half his money and pay back anybody that he might have defrauded by 4 times. He said, anybody I might have defrauded, he said, if I have defrauded anyone. You know, some say that Zacchaeus was one and the same with Matthias or Matthew. Some Bible scholars say that. There's no proof of that, but the Bible says very little about many of the people that Jesus interacted with, how they lived the rest of their lives out. You know, Matthias, if he was Matthias, is the one that replaced Judas Iscariot as one of the 12 apostles. There's some discussion about who were the people that were called apostles. The sources I saw mention the 12 that we all know. Matthias, who took the place of Judas Iscariot, and 12 others that were mentioned in the New Testament are considered to be apostles of Jesus Christ. And I often wonder what happened to those people that Jesus influenced with miracles 25 years later from the time they did that. Did they go on and do miraculous things, or did they just fall back into their old ways? You know, did Zacchaeus become Matthias? There's no way to tell, but you know, something happened, because Wikipedia said there are 2.4 billion Christians in the world. Now, not every one of those that encountered Jesus fell back into their old ways of being a non-believer, or even Wikipedia wouldn't be saying that there are 2.4 billion Christians in the world. But that's what Wikipedia says. I wonder how many God says is what I wonder. But I'm more interested in what God says about me about that than I am how many He says there are in the world. You sometimes I feel I could move that mountain with my faith, and other days I just struggle to get through the day. We know that Zacchaeus was a man of wealth. Our lesson book said that unlike today, wealth was not admired like it is in our society today. Supposedly every 50 years, the land was supposed to be redistributed back to the original family that it belonged to when Joshua, when it was assigned to the tribes as outlined in Joshua. I said in theory. In practice, that didn't happen very often. That's not surprising. It's difficult to give up hard-earned assets, land and such. But it had to have proven difficult because from Joshua's time until when they conquered Jericho, until Jesus' time when he came into Jericho and Jerusalem, in the story of the New Testament, there's plenty of poor folks out there. If they'd have redistributed all that wealth like they talked about doing with that Jubilee every 50 years, unless they had a tremendous population growth, there shouldn't have been very many people there without any money. Some people think that we should do more of that today. It shouldn't surprise us that seems more popular with those that would be recipients rather than those that are going to be giving their wealth away. Acts 20:35 says, I've shown you all things, how that so ye ought to support the weak. And remember the words of Jesus, how he said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. How many times have I heard that in my life? My family told me that all the time when I grew up, especially around Christmas time. But at that time I was being disciplined with a belt sometime. And they also told me many times that this was going to hurt them more than it was me. And they were telling me it's better to give than receive. And I kind of ended up putting all that in the same basket. I was going, I don't know, I like it better to receive than I do give, and I sure don't think it's hurting them more than it is me, or they wouldn't be doing it. But there's at least one lie in that deal. But I never told Garrett, my son, when I disciplined him on account of that it was going to hurt him more than it was me. I didn't want him to feel that way. I never whipped Hope or Megan, even though I felt like they needed it worse after they were grown up than I did when they were young. I probably could have done it, one of them maybe a week or so ago, but that's not going to happen. I did one time at Christmas. Amy and I gave Hope and Megan and Garrett some money as a gift, and we told them that they could keep the money if they felt like they needed it worse than anyone else that they could possibly know of. And I don't know what they did with that money. We told them we weren't going to ask, but I hope it reinforced that it really can be better to give than to receive. Like I said when I started this, there's a contrast here, and I never really thought much about these two stories before because I just thought they were two separate stories. But some scholars say that the reason these two stories are here are to show you a contrast between the rich young ruler who came to Jesus and Zacchaeus. The rich young ruler came to Jesus, well respected, and I suspect tall in the eyes of the public. Zacchaeus came short in stature, certainly not highly respected. But at the end of the encounter, the rich young ruler went away shorter in respect in the eyes of the reader. And Zacchaeus went away from his encounter greater in the eyes of Luke. You could tell from the story, and I suspect by each of you when you read the story. Zacchaeus didn't say he was going to give up all his wealth and live a life of poverty based on his encounter. The rich young ruler didn't say he would give up anything. I think Zacchaeus signaled to Jesus that Jesus was more important to him than the money. And the rich young ruler signaled the opposite. So, that begs the question to each of us, especially me, which is most important to us? Thank you.